So, David, do you think this is a significant part of the future of journalism? The citizen journalist who doesn't get paid, he just goes where he thinks there's a story, maybe collaborating with some other people, and gets something out there that can be seen by the whole world if they have internet access?
I think it is significant, but I don't think it's the only part. I think what we see here is sort of what our friend Doug Engelbart would call collective intelligence, and our ability to focus collective attention on something. But then there's also, it's not only the sensing things, it's also the perception part and interpreting what you get in. And I think one thing that we need to address in citizen journalism is, of course, what are the credentials of the citizen journalist, and who do we know, or how do we know who the citizen journalist represents when they do the story?
Well, it's pretty easy if you have a specific political viewpoint or political agenda. It's pretty easy to create a story that seems to support that agenda.
Yes.
So, good.
I think in the past, like when you think about independent journalism versus mainstream journalism by bigger corporations, the independent journalists tried to affect mainstream. It would be trying to get a story picked up by mainstream media, and now actually can work around that. And then if they're there and they're live and they're getting like the Frank and Coleman debates, CNN will pick it up. They ended up being a source for CNN but it was because they have, like, I think during the recount they had 40,000 people tuned in live to their website. That's not a whole lot, but that's significant enough. And then CNN was like, we can't afford to send people to these things, and they're getting it live. So I think instead of just trying to fight mainstream media and get them to pay attention to stories, they can actually just go around it.
Well, it's also a question of where do we draw the line between activism and journalism? And I think that this is, we can say where the line goes between journalism and PR, but I think it's going to be more difficult to say where the line is going between activism and journalism.
See, I think this brings up a really interesting thing is, and we were talking earlier before we started taping about a guy from the Washington Post who was talking about declarative journalism being one of the future trends, and that is that journalism in the past, the ethics were to be objective as they can. Like, objectivity is a relative thing, but that was the ethics, to try to be objective, try to balance things. But now, since there's so many points of view out there, to be declarative with your point of view, but explain where you're coming from, so you're not like, it's about being like transparent. And so I think a lot of, like, you see Lube Dobbs, who was on CNN, he had a very strong point of view. Either people hated him or they loved him, but he had a big following. And if you have a pluralistic set of media companies that all have strong points of view, it all ends up balancing out, I think, there. So I think in the future people become more declarative, more point of view oriented, and it'll sort of sort itself out in the diversity.
Yeah, I think the whole sort of objective thing is problematic because, and it always was actually, in physics there's something they call the time paradox that's very esoteric and has to do with theory of relativity, and we won't go into it. But there's a joke version of it that actually is very true. It goes like this, that if you have a watch, you know what the time is, but if you have two, you're uncertain. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is what's happening, that when people have had one local newspaper or very few news sources, that has been the point of reference.
Does the new technology create any kind of philosophical change in the way journalism is done? Is it just new tools, or do the new tools create a new mindset? And if so, what is that mindset?
Well, I think it changes the definition because in the old days, up until a few years ago, when the story and the medium was bundled, journalism was defined by its relation to the medium. If you go to Oxford Learner's Dictionary, it says a journalist is somebody who prepares news and features for newspapers or broadcast. And of course, this is not relevant anymore. So we have to redefine journalism so that it isn't defined in terms of its relation to the medium, but in terms of its relation to the audience.